Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in. We'll just wait for a couple more minutes before we start so that we can give everyone a chance to join. Until then, please make yourselves comfortable and introduce yourselves in the chat box and where you're coming from. Yeah. Great. I think we can start. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining in. I am Sonal, and I'm part of the Economists for Future International. We are an international initiative aiming to mobilize economists and the influence they have to help arrest the planetary emergency. We do this through targeted research and advocacy. The discipline of economics has recently come under fierce critique, both from for a lack of diversity in terms of representation and for discrimination on the basis of race, gender, caste, and other group-based identities. This is an old problem, but the renewed conversation amidst the larger socio-political happenings gives all of us a chance to revisit the issue of identity within the discipline, and by those measures, identity of the discipline itself. It is also important that we go into the normative basis of the notions of, like diversity, inclusion, representation, and bring a decolonial analysis to our understanding. Today's session, titled Diversity and Representation in Economics, Global and Local Challenges, will make an attempt at engaging with some of these issues. For the same, we have a wonderful set of guests and in-house researchers joining us on the panel. The goal of this session is to highlight the structural causes behind the underrepresentation of global majority within the field of economics, which is present at the undergraduate level, continues into the rank of the academia, and is barely improving over time. The speakers today will make their interventions and will present empirical evidence on some of these issues. Before we get started, I'll give you all a quick rundown of the session itself. So we'll first have Nikhil and Natalie from Economists for Future, who will present their piece that was released by E4F earlier this year, followed by presentations from our invited speakers, who we are really excited to have with us today, and who I'll introduce in a bit. We're really hoping to start a conversation here, and I request all the panelists to engage with each other's presentation, but also to the members of the audience to bring in any questions and comments using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can choose to remain anonymous or not, and we'll address all the questions towards the end of all the presentations. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Natalie and Nikhil, our first set of presenters for the day. Natalie Gube is here with us. She joined the Economists for Future team in early 2021. She has studied mathematical economics at Colorado College and currently works in the space of education policy. She's based in the United States in Washington, D.C. Presenting alongside Natalie is Nikhil. Nikhil joined the E4F team in 2021 as well as the organizer for the team. He has a master's in ecological economics from the University of Leeds and currently works for Rethinking Economics International. So without any further delay, Natalie, Nikhil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sonal. I will just share my screen. So Natalie and I will be talking today about a research piece that we conducted last year, the end of last year, which was called Geographic Diversity in Climate Economics. The objective of the paper was to gather citation data on the most cited and most recent articles in the field of climate economics and identify their geographic and institutional locations around the world. Natalie will be going into the specifics of our research a bit later in the presentation. But to start off, I would just like to talk a bit about the theoretical frameworks that we used for the research and more generally why we think that diversity and representation geographically is important, especially in the field of climate economics. In the first case, there's a need for inclusion of marginalized peoples in the climate discourse. We know that the overwhelming majority of damages from climate change are taking place in the global south, and this is a trend which shows no sign of changing. So particularly in countries in South and East Asia, in Africa, in South America, these are the countries that are facing the overwhelming majority of damages from climate change. And we argue that denying people from these regions the ability and resources to create knowledge about the issues confronting them constitutes an epistemic injustice. This is a concept by which we argue that people are being done harm to in their capacity as knowers, in their capacity as knowledge creators. And the imperative of decolonizing climate discourse therefore requires the remediation of these injustices. The second thing that we wanted to highlight was that a lack of geographic representation can often result in biases in research methods and approaches. A recent book published by Ambler et al. Entitled Reclaiming Economics for Future Generations, they found that the lack of attention paid to issues such as structural inequality, neocolonialism, and climate change are tied to the dominance of white male perspectives emerging from global north-based institutions. Similarly, two very important papers by Chelwa and Briggs and Weather argue in the context of development in Africa. They find that the exclusion of native researchers results in biased methodologies and consequently can result in poor knowledge about the continent. This point essentially argues that by excluding native researchers, we can often just have inaccurate, incorrect, or biased information about how the economy of a particular location works. And as Natalie will discuss a bit later in the presentation, climate economics contains similar biases. One very distinct example of this is how countries in the global south often have a much higher risk of catastrophic weather events and natural disasters. However, these tend not to be encapsulated by state-of-the-art IAMs, which are integrated assessment models that are used for climate assessment by major economists and economic institutions. And these biases can have massive implications for estimates of the damages of climate change, but also how urgent the need is to remediate them. I'll now hand over to Natalie, who will walk you through the paper.
Thanks, thank you. Do you mind clicking to the next slide? Thanks. Yeah, so the purpose of this research was to try and quantify the level of geographic concentration in sort of the canon of climate economic scholarship. So we chose to focus on elite mainstream journal publications, limiting our sample to papers from the top 20 ranked journals of economics, which tended to be general interest journals. So I just want to be clear that it's not the only form of knowledge production and dissemination in climate economics, but it carries significant and probably outsized influence. So we think it carries a lot of weight when we talk about the marginalization of scholarship from the global south. And so that sort of formed the focus of our research. We used a Web of Science search in March of 2021 to identify the 50 most frequently cited papers in climate economics, looking for the keywords climate change, global warming, greenhouse gases, or carbon in the paper's title or abstract. And then we used publicly available biographical information, so looking for authors' CVs, personal websites, faculty profiles, to link each author's institutional affiliation. Also important to note that the institutional affiliation is not the same as where an author is from or how they self-identify. So we're definitely including some authors who are from the Global South or the global majority in our counts for Global North affiliated institutions. And part of that is just a limitation with the availability of data. But I think it also poses the question of how can global North-based institutions and funders shift resources and opportunities to make it possible for scholars based in the Global South to conduct research in climate economics. So like we're not focused on a scholar's individual decision to work at an institution in the Global North versus the Global South, but rather on the structural barriers to participation that are put up by those Global North-based institutions. And then we replicated this process for the 50 most recently published papers in climate economics. And I will talk more about the motivation for that later in the presentation. Thanks. So jumping right into the results here, we found really overwhelming geographic concentration, not just in the Global North, but specifically in the US, followed by the UK. So there were 90 unique contributors to the sample of most cited papers, and of those authors, 82% are affiliated with US-based institutions, 91% with US or UK-based institutions, and none with Global South-based institutions. Breaking down those results a bit further, we also found really high levels of concentration at the level of the university. So those authors spanned 49 universities, but more than half of them were affiliated with just 14 departments of economics. The University of California system, for example, hosts 15% of total authors. Harvard and MIT each comprise 6.7%. That in itself is a serious limitation on just the breadth of perspective and sort of the informing climate policy making. It makes for a very narrowly situated body of knowledge. But again, I think what is most problematic here is that the publication disparities are replicating and entrenching patterns of inequity and injustice in the global economy. So it's not just that there's a small number of countries and institutions, but that those represented are in positions of global socioeconomic power, of colonial power. Could we click to the next slide? Thanks. This chart shows the per capita gross national income of the countries represented in the most cited literature relative to the distribution as a whole. And all of them fall above the global median. Most are more than double the global median. At the same time, we know that lower income countries are already disproportionately affected by climate-related disasters and will be hit hardest by ongoing climate change. So one of the things that Chelwa discusses in his analysis of economic scholarship on Africa is the potential for false consensus to emerge from an isolated and sort of physically distant group of academics that can end up guiding policy. And as Nikhil mentioned, his paper was really influential in our conception of this research. And I think that's something that really hits home with when I look at this chart. It's that it's a very small number of people in rich country institutions in the global north that set the norms and boundaries for mainstream climate economic scholarship, and then likely end up citing each other and entrenching that consensus further. Thanks. Ready for the next slide? Thanks. So after doing this analysis, I don't think that like my team or I were surprised by the trends that we saw, but the scale was so stark that it sort of prompted us to wonder to what degree this has changed. A lot of the papers we cited as or included in the most cited sample were published in the earlier 2000s or 1990s. And so we wanted to do some sort of comparison to see whether we've moved towards greater diversity as the magnitude of the climate crisis has grown. So we repeated the process with the 50 most recently published articles using the same keywords and looking in the same journals, again, as of March 2021. And we found that 49% of authors were affiliated with US-based institutions. That was down from 89%. And 51% were based in the US or UK. That was down from 91%. But still less than 1% of authors were affiliated with an institution in the Global South. So I think while there was a reduction in sort of the overwhelming dominance of US-based scholarship, it just doesn't really look like radical change, and there is still epistemic injustice at play. So what does this mean for how economists study climate change? First, Nikhil discussed earlier that the marginalization of research from the Global South results in siloed methodologies. And for instance, the dominance of integrated assessment models in mainstream climate economics can seriously understate the potential for catastrophic climate damages and underemphasize the distributional nature of climate impacts. There's also a level of inherent uncertainty embedded in the climate crisis because the Earth system is nonlinear. There are irreversible thresholds of warming that once we go past those, climate impacts are locked in. And so responding to climate change involves ethical questions around who bears that risk, how do we respond to unpredictability, and who gets to make those choices. Lastly, I think this analysis sheds some light on the resistance to the notion of common but differentiated responsibility in the economics discourse. And as Southern scholars and activists have argued for a long time, the countries most responsible for climate change should shoulder the costs of decarbonization. But that ethical obligation doesn't find much of a place in mainstream climate economic thinking. So I think I will pass back to Sonal here, but thanks everyone for attending and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Natalie and Nikhil. So I think your research note and the presentation investigates like a brilliant set of intersection and the extent to which this exclusion is mirrored in economics journal publications and how the top journals, and by that extension, top universities, top conferences, despite this exclusion, are viewed as flag bearers of objective scientific knowledge, right? Hopefully that will bring in some interesting discussion points amongst the rest of the panelists and also the audience. So I'll pass on the forum to our next presenter, Veronica, Professor Veronica Amarante. By the way of introduction, Veronica is a professor at the Institute of Economics from the Economics Department at the University of the Republic in Uruguay. She's also a research fellow at the Partnership for Economic Policy. Previously, she was the director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean office in Montevideo. Her research has focused on geographic diversity in development economics and gender representation and labor economics. So Veronica, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see my screen? Okay. So first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry about that. To thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. It's very good news that more and more people are trying to put these issues into the agenda. And what I'm trying to do in these minutes is to tell you about a line of research that we are trying to pursue from based on the Partnership for Economic Policy, that basically wants to bring evidence about the underrepresentation of researchers from the South in the different arenas of discussion in development economics. The motivation, it's very similar to what the previous presenters have been discussing. Basically, in both in conferences and in publications in development economics, we find that the diversity is really a problem, and this has consequences in terms of the research agenda that we are building more globally. It also has consequences for the development of the careers of researchers, but that is like a more individual approach. But what we argue is that it has consequences in terms of the agenda. The conferences and the publications in peer-reviewed journals are crucial areas for the academic community from the South. They contribute to the dissemination of our research and also to the strengthening of the quality, because we are by participating in these forums, we are subject to quality, to a quality environment. Networking at conferences also, we all know that it's crucial, especially for young people and for mentoring opportunities. So what we argue is that more prominent presence of Southern-based researchers, and I will then explain how we approach to this concept of Southern-based researchers in the international scientific community, both in conferences and in publications, will derive a benefit in terms of the connection between social and economic situation in the countries, institutional conditions and policy recommendations, because people-based researchers based in those places are much more involved with these aspects. It's also a driving force for strengthening the national research systems in Southern countries. It helps to set priorities, and also it may end up having consequences in terms of the investments in policies. And while it provides more diversity in the academic community, this is being much more discussed in this year and in these years. And what we have done is present 2 papers. I will just show some parts of them and the main messages. Both papers basically analyze or provide evidence about the representation of Southern researchers in conference, in development economics, in publications, and there we have some information about the process of publication, because some journals were kind enough to give us data about the desk rejections and the process. And then we, similarly to the previous study, we also consider the papers that are finally published in development journals. What we understand here by Southern researchers is researchers located in a country classified as LIMC according to the World Bank definition. So there we have different approaches to how to define this, but what we are working now is with this definition. So in terms of conferences, we have evidence for these 7 development conferences, which are big conferences in this field. And in these 9 years, what we find is, first of all, that they were always hosted in developed countries, with one exception, which is the African Development Bank Conference. And here, very briefly, some of the results. There we have the representation, the papers that are presented from researchers based in universities in the north, that is the upper green line, or universities in the south, that is the red line, a big gap there, a very low participation of researchers from the south. Of course, this does not sum up to 100, because we have presentation from people based on international organizations and other kinds of institutions, but this is a clear representation of what is happening here in this discussion, in these forums of discussion, and it's quite stable in the years that we consider, the last decade. Basically, there's not much change. For the analysis of the process of the publications, we have information. We ask information to the top 20 development economic journals, and we got the data from four journals, which are those. They are Economic Development and Cultural Change, the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, the Review of Development Economics, and the Journal of African Economies. and we asked them the information about submissions broken down by the institutional affiliation of the lead authors. I have to say that some of the journals replied that they would like to contribute, but it was complicated for them to get the data from with the editors and that thing. So it's not that the journals denied to provide the information, but sometimes this was not so easy apparently to get. So what we got from these journals, there you have the number of submissions. I think this, I don't remember exactly the period that this table has, but we have the number of submissions, the distribution of submissions by regions, and there we see that in some specific journals, like the Review of Development Journals or the Journal of African Economies, submission from Southern researchers are more than around 60%. So, whereas in the other two, which are like more top journals, the Review of Development Economics and the Journal of African Economies are more like middle in the ranking. In the other ones, the submissions from Southern researchers are lower. And if we go to the column of the desk rejections, which is, I think it's important. We don't have that for the Journal of African Economists. They were not able to provide that, but we can see that the rate of desk rejection from submission from the South is much higher than from the North. So this may have many reasons, and I will try to discuss that, because it may be the result of very different forces there, but the evidence is that the desk rejections are much higher. And if we go to the last column, which is finally which ones were accepted, we have there basically that higher rates of acceptance for northern for researchers from northern countries or located in northern countries. As in the previous presentation, we are not looking the nationality of researchers, but the place where their main institutions, their main academic institutions are located. So this gives like a clear picture of the differences in the possibilities of publishing. Another important thing is that if we look there, the percentage of papers accepted once reviewed, or those that passed the desk rejection and went into the review process, in some of in the economic development and cultural change, the rates are quite similar. The gap is higher in the other two journals, but it's fair to say that once the paper gets into review in that journal, the rates of rejection are similar. So what the third piece of evidence that I wanted to present, it's like a study on the publications. We study also articles and citations. I will just present some basic results. What we do is we analyze the presence of researchers based in the South in 20 development economic journals, and also the relevance of the articles referring to citations. We take our database for Scopus Elsevier in the period 1990 to 2019. Each paper, we classify each paper according to two criteria, the authorship and the topic. I'm also only presented the part referring to the authorship, to the geographical location of the authors. We classify as Northern researchers, Southern researchers, and also collaborations, when an article is written by a researcher located in a Southern country and a researcher located in a Northern country. As I say, our classification derived from the World Bank classification according to the income of the country. I will not present this data of the topics. We did this for the 20 top development economic journals according to the Google ranking, and then we also did it with an alternative list ranking of development journals that combines three different rankings, and the results are basically the same because the changes in the positions are not much. So what we see, first of all, is the increase in the number of articles being published in development journals. In the graph, you also see that the number of articles published by only by Northern researchers is the higher line there, which also increases a lot. But we also see that the collaborations between Southern and Northern researchers in this period increases in absolute terms and also in relative terms. And there you have the distribution in relative terms, and you see that those collaborations in the middle of the graph have been increasing during this period, and this we were interested in what does that represent, and what kind of work, what kind of collaborations were those. And we find basically similarly to what some of the results that were presented, we have United States and the United Kingdom as the main places where researchers from northern countries are located. Those researchers included in the collaborations. So there, with the colors, we try to show the links with other countries. For example, researchers in the case of Latin America, which we were also interested in knowing something about collaborations between researchers in Latin America and in other northern countries. The collaborations are basically with the United States. You see the red or orange color there in the lines that shows the main collaborations, whereas the network for the United Kingdom researchers is basically in countries in South Africa. It's very important, and you have also other African countries, English-speaking African countries, and there we have in the other colors, for example, the purple or the blue, the other main networks of collaboration. But this is led basically by the United States and United Nations. And what we also looked, and we have two other, I don't know if the time, if I am taking too much time because I didn't look at it, but I would like to add that we also looked the editors in those journals, and this is interesting because a very high percentage or most of the editors are located in northern countries. The exception is the regional the regional development journal, which is the African one, and there we have a higher representation of editors located in the, okay, thank you, editors located in the in the north, in the south, sorry, but we also find, and we also have evidence in the second paper, that we cannot talk about a causality, but we have a clear association between the importance of researchers, of editors based in the south in the journals, and the number of papers published from southern researchers. So there is something going on there about networks or connections, and so this gives also some hints about what could be done from the. I mean, I completely agree that northern-based institutions have a role to play here, because it's not only advocacy from other parts, but also some changes in the rules. And there, I think in the editors, we may have something to add. I cannot change the so. What we find is basically that the discussion in development economics is among researchers located in the north, principally, both at conferences and in the more prestigious academic journals. The research is conducted and discussed by researchers from the north. This may be, as I said, for a consequence of many different things. It may also reflect deficiencies in research skills from southern researchers, the problem of the English language proficiency. It's important. We also find evidence in our analysis that in those collaborations between northern and southern researchers, in most cases, the northern researcher was English speaking and the other researchers was not. So there may be different causes behind how these networks are built. Of course, as I said, scientific networks and access to research funders, access to travel grants. All those things are behind these results that we are finding both in conferences and in development journals. They also may be a result of the culture of exclusivity in the economic profession. In our paper, we talked about some unconscious biases because if you review a paper, you have hints about where is the, even by the English in the paper, you have hints about probably the location of the researcher. So we find that there may be some practices, paradigms, and as I said, also some unconscious biases that may be excluding some researchers and inhibiting this plurality and this diversity that we would like to see in development economics. We find that the collaborations may be a way, an avenue to change, to find a change, but also here the incentives to cooperation between centers from developed and developing countries sound like something, a place where we may be thinking about doing something. And with respect to that, we at PEP, at the Partnership of Economic Policy, we launched a call to action that aims at contributing to increasing the participation of Southern researchers in economic development. And I invite you to look at this page. We have a lot of additions from researchers from different parts of the world, and we try to enumerate some of the things that I was telling you about our discussion after having this evidence from publications and from conferences. We changed them to a specific call to action in terms of advancing towards more diversity in development economics. So thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. While you were making your presentation, it just came to me that the discipline of, the branch of economics, development economics, is viewed to be dealing with issues of the global south and is perceived as a special branch of economics that studies the economics representing an out of ordinary phenomenon and where the objective rules do not really apply. And that's generally, the mainstream way of looking at development economics. And the trends that you were presenting are not surprising, but they're appalling. At the level of content, even this South-focused discipline views the global South as an undesirable aberration. And when you see it in terms of knowledge creation and who has the highest stakes, you see these trends coming up. Maybe we can discuss some of these things during our discussion. I think this might be an opportune time to call our next panelist, Professor Gregory N. Price. Gregory is a professor of economics at the University of New Orleans, USA. His previous appointments include Charles E. Merrill Professor and Chair, Department of Economics, Morehouse College, Director of the Mississippi Urban Research Center, Professor of Economics at the Jackson State University, and Economics Program Director at the National Science Foundation. He's also past president of the National Economic Association, an applied econometrician and theorist. His current research efforts are in economic stratification, African economic development, the causes and consequences of slavery/entrepreneurship. His research has been published widely in a variety of journals. So Gregory, over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's afternoon where I'm at, and I appreciate the opportunity. What I don't have, I don't have a prepared slide. So my press and I even understand was a panel discussion, but I think I can make a substantial contribution here. So we're talking about these north-south divides, these north-south disparities, and I want to focus on two: north-south disparities in material living standards and the production of scientific knowledge. Now, I want to pose a thought experiment. Imagine tomorrow we were to wake up and there was a convergence between the North and South with zero variance in per capita living standards, and I'll benchmark the United States, let's say it's $55,000 per year, all over, zero variance, and that we all had equal representation in all the scientific journals from anthropology, A to Z, zoology. Now, my question is, would that be a good thing? It's a question. Would that be a good thing? Now, I want to give this some long historical context. If we take seriously the work of the late Angus Madison and the contributions of Michael Kramer about the evolution of human material living standards from the time we showed, as far as you know, from the time we showed up on the planet about 200,000 years ago, up to about 1,700, 400 years ago, pretty much still flat. The evidence suggests, and this is where we need more global representation of anthropologists and archaeologists who can tell us something about the evolution of human living standards in the past in India and Africa and Australia. But right now, the evidence suggests that basically human material living standards were flat for most of human evolutionary history up until about 1700. Then they started changing. Now, the question is, if we were to have convergence in that there overnight, would that be a good thing? In other words, would our happiness scale up to our incomes? In other words, think of, I'm an American, obviously, and over the last 30 years, the square footage of our houses have doubled. So has energy. Is that a good thing for the entire world to have big, roomy homes and open highways like the United States and have Walmarts and Costco's stacked with all sorts of snacks and goods and all this variety? Would that be a good thing for human? And I'll invoke the old Greek notion of eudaimonia, the good life. Would that be a good thing, right? So, and one of the things, sometimes I have to check myself when I weigh in about the causes and consequences of African economic development. You reach the conclusion that, well, had there not been colonialism and slavery, the living standards would have been higher. In other words, they would be more like the West. Okay, yes, that appears to be true, but is that a good thing? Is that a good thing? Would that not contribute to our ongoing crisis of extracting more and more resources from the planet, and it's unsustainable? So increasingly, I'm getting philosophical about this work. In other words, what do we really want? Yeah, these disparities we see between the North and the South they're troubling, as we see even within the West, disparities between blacks and whites in the United States are troubling. But what do we really want? We want everybody to have these high material and unsustainable living standards that go on, and we keep scaling it up. So I'm becoming increasingly philosophically suspect about what we're advocating for, what constitutes a good life. So we lament these disparities. And ultimately, what I suspect is that we lament these disparities in material living standards. We all want 4,000 square foot homes. We want more cars. We want more food. We want more stuff. The stuff. So the idea that human well-being is tied to material prosperity, the idea of economism that emerges, as far as I can tell, the idea that emerges in Europe in the 16th century, with the you get the wealth of nations that we all want to hitch our wagon to the consumption train, the consumption horse. That's a good thing. So we lament these disparities, say, well, all right, these vulgar disparities in material living standards, these vulgar disparities in production of knowledge. Do we want the global South to produce the same type of knowledge that leads to the same type of problems we see in the West? So we say voices. What voices do we want to hear? Of course, we want to hear more. But what voices will be more viable? Will they prevent us from reaching a crisis, an existential crisis in how we live? So we close. What disparities do we want to close? What goal do we want to reach? We all want Walmarts. We all want a 4,000 square foot house. Can the globe really tolerate that there? Is that a good thing? Now, of course, there should be a rock bottom floor, which, miserable human deprivation, that who wants that? But do we want all these living standards? Do we want to close all these material disparities? Do we all want, access to the same journals, producing the same type of prognoses and descriptions of the human condition? I say maybe not. What about eudaimonia? What about human well-being? Where are the voices about that? Is it all tied to the consumption wagon? Right. So I'll leave it at this. So yeah, I do a lot of work in disparities, but at the end I'm saying, well, had there not been colonialism and slave trading, and Africa would have looked more like the West, but okay, yeah, the living standards would have been higher material, but there'll be consequences of that too. So when you raise all these material living standards around the world, when you close all the disparities, is that, this sounds controversial, but is that a world we want? Is that a world we actually want? So I'll open the floor for a consideration of that there, but what is human well-being? What is eudaimonia? What's our vision of what it means to live a good human life? You know?
Thanks, Gregory. I think that opens up a lot of Pandora boxes. I was just wondering if we want to do like a quick round of responses to earlier presentations. Maybe we can start with Nikhil and Natalie, and then Veronica, and then Gregory. Yeah. And also a reminder to our audience to please put in the questions in the Q&A box. We'll be taking them after the discussion is done. Yeah.
So let me add, human economic growth is a relatively recent. It's a relatively recent thing. The idea that we can live better than our parents is fairly recent in human history, right? I mean, the last 400 years that we can have more and more. I mean, that appears to be fairly recent. I mean, for a long time we had flat living standards, and I mean, I can't survey humans from 30,000 years ago, but I wonder, were they happy when world living standards were pretty much flat for long stretches of time? There were no journals. I mean, there was cultural productions, we had we had the Bhagavad Gita, we had the Bible, we had the Upanishads, there were cultural productions of knowledge, but we didn't.
Nikhil, Natalie, yeah.
Yeah, I could jump in. First, just wanted to thank you to both of our speakers for some very interesting, very thought-provoking presentations. I think maybe one thing I wanted to pick up on is the last point, the point that Gregory was trying to make about like the connection between what kind of knowledge do we want to produce in the context of sort of diversifying the economics profession, including more voices from the global south, more scholarship from the global south. Do we want that scholarship to be essentially following the same theoretical choices, the same methodological choices as the research that is being produced by global north institutions, just being done by global scholars coming from the global south or from any other marginalized identity within a certain geographic region? And I think my answer would be no. I think we would want, and also to a large extent, I think we would expect that knowledge being produced by communities at the margins of the global economy, of national economies, would, through their own lived experiences, but also the theoretical sort of world of knowledge producing that they are produced in, that those people come out of, that should be a different way of thinking, that it should be a way of thinking that directly challenges, directly opposes the sort of hegemonic dominant way of thinking about issues like material well-being, how rates of resource extraction affect particular communities. I think what we would want from a reformed profession, from an economics profession, economics knowledge production system that prioritizes voices from the global south, would also be one that directly challenges the theoretical, the methodological biases and frameworks that are used by scholars of the north to study the south.
Natalie?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, also thank you to both the speakers as well. It's a lot of thoughts running through my head trying to organize them into a coherent thought here. But I guess the couple of things that are surfacing for me is first related to what Nikhil had mentioned. I think I'm interested by the level of like how self-referential is this body of work, and I assume high, and I think that helps explain what we see in terms of the dominance of integrated assessment models as we were looking at before. Like if every paper in this journal that is being published is taking a particular methodological approach, then it makes sense that in order to critique and engage with that body of work, it needs to be somehow focused on tweaking that model at the margins rather than presenting something entirely different. So I guess that through this conversation, and it has helped me to conceptualize better the ways in which concentration at the level of journal publications can reinforce specific ways of modeling and looking at the world, even when papers are attempting to make criticism of that, by deepening those patterns of citation and what is the critique facing, what is the starting point for divergence rather than allowing new knowledge and methodological approaches to come through on their own. But another response that I had to Veronica's presentation around the role of collaborations that we might be able to talk about at some point too is thinking about what equitable collaborations can look like. And EFRAF conducted an interview series a couple of months back. And one of the insights that had surfaced from that was around the limitations that can be imposed on research collaborations between the Global North and Global South, and particularly the ways in which researchers and institutions on the Global South have been pushed into roles that are more focused on data collection and coordination rather than theoretical modeling, research production. And personally, as a researcher based in the Global North, I have been sort of interrogating what does an equitable research collaboration look like, and would welcome further conversation on that from any of the panelists.
Thanks, Natalie. I was just trying to articulate the several points that Gregory put forth. I think the larger understanding at E4F and behind this research, and a lot of what we do in trying to understand how journal publish, what's the pattern, etc., is I think representation as an issue is indispensable for the project of challenging dominant economic thinking, since it creates a space for global majority voices, something that Nikhil also said, and through it opens the possibility for us to challenge the ideas and understanding as to what consumption would mean, what human well-being would mean. And I think representation, therefore, is an important and even necessary step for this goal. However, a broader understanding of diversity is also indispensable, because I think we're largely discussing representation and diversity, right? So that understanding needs to go beyond diversity, beyond social identities of gender, caste, religion, race, and geographical positionality. And this is where, Gregory, maybe your point might resonate well. It says, what we also need is diversity of other non-mainstream and South-centric schools of economic thought that, despite being present in economics, are actively subordinated and marginalized. And we need a space for pluralities, space for distinct meanings of economic progress, modernity for that matter, and that are outside the narrow understanding of mainstream knowledge. And I think that's what we talk about when we talk about North-South divide in knowledge production. I think the first step towards ensuring the diversity in economics warrants recognizing the politics of knowledge creation. And I think that's precisely why we question some of these things. And that's where the whole study comes from as well, I think. So yeah, Veronica, I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I was trying to like organize a bit what we are discussing, and I think we have two questions here, which are what kind of knowledge we want to produce, and that is something related to the mainstream or not mainstream or hegemonic, and then also how we want to produce it, in which environment we want to produce it. But they are both connected, because my motivation when I began looking at these things, I've work a lot of time in inequality issues, but in income inequality issues. I mean, you know, or labor market discrimination, like other that also look at somehow in many cases as diversity, but completely not, I mean, not the same like looking at this, but with the respect to how we want to produce it, in which environment. I would say that what we are trying in our research to advocate is that we want to produce, we are advocating from epistemic justice. I like very much Nikhil reference to Miranda Fricker work. I mean, we are advocating for the decolonization of the academic arena. I mean, for different voices, and it's closely related to what kind of knowledge we want to produce. Because if there is, if that idea or epistemic justice it does not permeate, or is not in the academic community, then the different kind of academic knowledge that we may be wanted to produce will not be able to reach that arena. So, I mean, the origin is like this idea of epistemic justice or decolonization. With respect to what kind of knowledge we want to produce, I mean, like here we are advocating for different kind of knowledge that have a space in the arenas that we have defined, that the community has defined, that are the quality or prestigious. I mean, there is a complete another issue there, which we may also think about other ways and think, well, let's do our journals and like other ways of thinking about how we want to show the research, and to finally, when we are researching, the basic idea behind that is that you want something to change and you want to collaborate to that process. So, but the risk there is the academic isolation. I mean, I think that for Southern researchers, a big risk in this discussion is that it's pretty much tied to the idea of like accepting the rules of the game, and that may create some, I mean, internal reaction to that. They say, well, let's do other, but the other ways are, the attention is very high, because other ways, like creating other forums, other conferences, other places, are very hard and have the risk of the academic isolation, which I think would be a real danger. And also about the collaborations and what Natalie was bringing to the conversation, we are now trying to understand some kind of pattern behind those collaborations. And for example, to our results, we received a comment that was that it may mainly be driven, the increasing collaborations, to the expansion of RCTs or randomized controlled trials in the development economic field. And so it will be like those kind of asymmetrical collaborations, researchers in the nodes like leading and having a person in 1,000 countries to like collect the data or do field work, but very constrained to a very basic support to the research, and not really living things. With that comment, or with that idea, we have been now looking at trying to find a pattern there, and that is not the case. For example, with respect to randomized control trials, there may be other hypotheses or other things going there, but the truth is that something that seems to have as randomized control trials seem to have changed or be a very big issue in development economics. If you look at the publications, are very, at least in the development economic journals, they are really a small number, with a very, the higher citations. We know about the Nobel Prizes. I mean, the impact is very, very high, but it's not widespread. So that was just that I do not have an answer about the nature of the collaborations and what is behind. And I think it's a very important question, because I mean, again, we are advocating for an equal collaboration, but we don't have the answer to that. And there I mean, the limitations for trying to find something, the answer to that, as you may imagine, are high, but we are trying to go deeper there. We also have the role of international organizations there, because I didn't mention it, but if you look at the institutions, some of the big collaborators are, for example, IFRI or some specific institutions that may also have their own research agenda or interests, and are also in this collaboration. So there's something that we need to understand better, I think. And over to you, Sonal.
Thanks, Veronica. Gregory?
So let me just add that, as an editor of a heterodox journal who's been around 52 years, I mean, at some point we really have to start helping ourselves. I mean, the Quarterly Journal of Economics start with volume 1, and over the years they've worked hard to solidify their orthodox position, and they're not going to cede any authority overnight. So it's important for heterodox scholars to constantly create their own intellectual communities. The barriers to entry for creating new journals has decreased, and we have extant heterodox journals, in which I certainly welcome submissions from the global South. But so we have to help ourselves and understand that power concedes nothing without demand, and that all ideas are contestable. We can't wither in the face of opposition or being ignored. We just have to keep pressing. We have to cite one another. I mean, one of the things that always troubles me is that how other heterodox scholars don't cite other heterodox scholars. I mean, citation becomes the currency, and it's how we're born posthumously. So we have to stay committed to contesting ideas that are not necessarily robust. In fact, that is the very model of science, that ideas have to be contested. We have existing journals, and the barriers to forming new ones have fallen. I mean, they've fallen. So we have to press on with this here stuff. And again, so as an editor of a so-called heterodox journal, I mean, I welcome submissions from the global South as well as the global North. I mean, so they're there. And now, if you're a mere careerist and you merely want to get tenure at a top 50 university anywhere in the world, well, I mean, there's not much I can tell you that. You just want to pad your vita and say, oh, I've been published in Restat or Economica. Fine, you're a mere careerist. But if you're a conscientious scholar, you're going to do the work anyway. And I want to encourage you to do so, regardless of where it's published at. If you just have to get into a fancy, high prestige journal, good luck. Take your shot. But please, if you're a conscientious heterodox scholar, I appreciate your efforts. I do appreciate your efforts, and consider the universe of existing journals, or if there are new ones. I mean, don't allow yourself to be demoralized about producing and publishing your so-called heterodox ideas. Okay.
Thanks, Gregory. Maybe I just want to check if any of you want to respond back to anything that you guys have spoken in the last 10 minutes. Otherwise, we can move on to audience Q&A as well. I suppose. I think one of the questions that people are asking, an anonymous attendee has asked, is about equitable collaboration that Natalie brought up, and Veronica said that there are no easy answers for that. And but just wanted to bring it back to our conversation, because Gregory just mentioned that cite more heterodox authors, and can that be seen as building larger synergy? Or I mean, what do you guys think about that? I suppose it's a difficult question.
I think with respect to that, we have a problem in all of us. I mean, people in the North, people in the South, about how we reflect. I mean, citations is the way, but we may think also in many ways we are influenced by the research that we read from other researchers. And it is true that we tend not, northern researchers tend not to cite researchers from the south or journals, for example, regional journals. I mean, an example is I don't know the Latin. I mean the regional journals for Latin America and economics are mainly not cited or not cited, and this also reflects not real, no, because it's like I mean which is the impact. We have there a question that I think is very interesting, that is if research should if researchers we need to rethink the way research is structured, going beyond just publications and conferences. I mean, I think there is something also because the academia, I mean, is much more and more concentrated on this kind of dissemination. There were other ways. If you look only 3 decades ago, there were other ways of disseminating the research results, and they have really lost a lot of power those ways, and we are much more focused and isolated from the rest of the society. Researchers focus on very specific academic forums and isolated. So there, I think we have there like two things. One is our citations of and every researcher citation of the work of others, and then also how we choose to disseminate our research. That also has to do with the incentives that are provided by the institutions where we work, and there is a very big issue there, how we have been, at least, I mean, in regional universities in Latin America, we have been changing our ways of evaluating researchers, and so that's very explicit incentives to the and a definition of what a researcher should do or try to do. So there is another very big aspect which enters into this discussion.
Anybody else wants to take a jab at it?
You know, again, this, you know, I guess I've been around a long time, but, you know, these, you know, we can't allow ourselves to be demoralized by existing institutional structures. We just got to be committed to a level of conscientiousness. Are we mere careers, or do we want to actually engage the causes and consequences of what we see around the world? Or are we just mere careers? And that's only something we can determine for ourselves. I mean, do you just want tenure? You just want a line you vita that you publish in a top 10 journal? Or are we committed scholars? Are we committed scholars to the truth, to scientific truth? And recognizing that doing that, it may result in a derailment of our careers at a prestigious university. We may not, and by the way, you may not get in a prestigious journal anyways. When I look at the Journal of Political Economy, for example, acceptance rates are below 5%. So that means even if you're in a top 30 university doing orthodox stuff, you could actually spend 4 careers not getting in that journal. So that's, you know, that's a very dangerous game in itself, if you're just doing it for its own sake versus trying to be a serious, committed scholar, right? So, you know, so that's more words of advice, and after being around quite some time, seeing, you know, observing this here. But do the work you're interested in, that you're committed to, and publish it as a working papers, or disseminate them. And as Nietzsche once said, some men and women are born posthumously. It's the work we must do. It's the work that has to be done. It has to be done. Yeah. Right.
Thanks, Gregory. There's an interesting question, and I think that that somehow deals with what Veronica and Gregory just mentioned. Says researchers from the Global South can try citing those from Global South, but evidence suggests that their work will not get selected. What can a researcher do in this position to try and sustain themselves professionally, but also try and propagate perspectives from the Global South? I think the question again brings us back to how do we study structural inequalities, and by that matter, what is our definition of epistemic justice, so to say. So yeah, Veronica, Gregory, Natalie, Nikhil, anyone?
Yes, I would say that we should try to cite all the work that is relevant for our work, for our research, and I mean, and not be conditioned by this thing that you have all your, if all your references are from, I mean, from, I don't know, Latin America, because you're working there and the work has been done there, you should you should try to go with that. The truth is that I also think, because I understand Gregory's point about the personal or individual consciousness as a researcher, and I agree with that, but I also think that we as a community should be trying to show the rest of the world, or try to make some movement from the other side, because you look, for example, at very specific research on issues where researchers from that country have done, I mean, very good papers that are published, but in regional papers or working papers, and they do not appear. So what you may think, well, they do not know this, or they do not cite this because of the rules of the game that are, as the question, as that person showed in the question, are very, very unfair. So I think we should also, I believe that at least trying to put this into the discussion, the agenda, and put all the mechanisms that are behind, the underlying mechanisms that are behind these results that we are showing the results, and then try to discuss all these unfair underlying mechanisms. I also think it's important to try to make some movement there, or at least to sound that the problem sounds there.
Yeah. So, on that, so, as an editor of a journal, one of the things I do is that when I send out manuscripts to scholars and referee, it could be some of you, part of your job, you should take the opportunity to referee a manuscript on a topic of relevance to the Global South, to use that to scrutinize the work for whether or not it recognizes the work of scholars in the Global South, or scholars who address issues of Global South. That's also how you produce knowledge. You produce knowledge not just by publishing, but also by scrutinizing the potential published work of others. When you referee the journals, scrutinize it heavily for whether or not scholarship relevant to the Global South is being cited and built upon. So we also got to take our refereeing work sort of half serious. I mean, we can get overwhelmed sometimes, but it's important. That's another way in which we can also steer the production of knowledge relevant to the Global South and inequality in general around the world. So your role as referee, your role as editor or co-editor, your role as a paper conference participant. That's, so we can do this many ways. I mean, but, we have to be sort of half committed to it. We have to, because it's not going to happen by itself. I mean, the status quo is a status quo for a reason, right? It's there for a reason. If it goes uncontested, it'll remain the status quo for a very long time. I mean, the Quarterly Journal of Economics here in the United States has been around, since the 1890s. So it's got it's over a century long. I mean, so they're not going to cede that intellectual turf easily. They're just not going to cede that turf. And when I say turf, their so-called perspective on what constitutes good social and economic science. They're just not going to do that. I mean, you're naive. You think, okay, hey, come on in, Global South, marginalized scholars, give us your viewpoints on what you think is really the cause and consequence of inequality. No, I don't think I'd be surprised. And I'm happy to be wrong about that. But no, we have to commit to doing the work at many levels, refereeing, editing at conferences, making the critical comments at conferences, and so forth and so on. Okay.
Sorry, Nikhil, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just briefly to add to that, also by putting those ideas out and communicating to non-economic audiences and more public-facing audiences is an important opportunity to put economic work out in the world for scrutiny and for critique. I mean, I know that's close to the Rethinking Economics, the heart of the Rethinking Economics mission, and I currently work for a journalism organization, so I'd spent a lot of time thinking about data communication and I think, and I don't know how we get there, but to value to welcome and respond to and value public pushback on economic work is also a way of getting to a place where those orthodox ideas are challenged and from a broader range of perspectives than like the neoclassical canon.
Nikhil, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to just ask sort of a question to the other panelists, and maybe this is a nice way to kind of bring the session towards a close. But obviously, you know, at Economists of Future, we sort of are trying to model ourselves and trying to build a campaign group, essentially, a group of students, of young professionals, of early career researchers, of PhD students, people associated within the economic space in some way. And this is also the mission of the broader Rethinking Economics movement as a student movement around the world. What we're trying to do is build campaigns led by mainly by young people in the economic space, to make a lot of the changes that we've been discussing, to put pressure on journal publishers, on editors, to put pressures on universities, to put pressure on funding institutions, these kind of things. So I guess one question that I maybe wanted to ask the two panelists is, what kind of campaigns should we as students, as young people in the economic space, what kind of campaigns should we be launching? What kind of pressure should we be putting on the institutions that we're a part of, whether it's as students, as researchers? What kind of pressure should we be putting on our own institutions?
Well, I mean, you for one thing, I mean, as students, undergraduates, graduates, I mean, if you're mindful enough, you can, if in your various social sciences courses, political science, sociology, anthropology, economics, demand a more diverse reading list of, at request for more diverse reading list of alternative viewpoints, not just one dominant viewpoint. So you start there in the classroom. And if you're a graduate student, the same thing there as well, too. I mean, the speaker series that come in the various social sciences that speak to the North-South divides. Can we have a representation of alternative viewpoints, alternative research paradigms? So things like that. I mean, they go along the way toward, creating more balance, in the classroom, the reading list, the speakers on campuses in the various social sciences. And ultimately that'll show up in what's ultimately published, And of course, if you demand diversity of reading lists, you'll get a diversity of journals across the relevant social sciences. So things like that. I mean, that's something we can all do, we can all do. But for example,
yes, I would add to that diversity in the curriculum, diversity in the reading list, and diversity in the proposed curricula in the graduate formation.
Thanks. So, Nikhil, I'm guessing your question is answered. Do you have any follow-up question on that? No? Okay, great. So I think that this might be a good time to close the session as well. Just to borrow from a sociologist named Eric Wright, I think the whole project around diversity and representation is an emancipatory, social, and scientific project. It's emancipatory because it aims to go beyond the discursive oppression, the oppression that is created specifically by a systematic marginalization of the non-West-centric strands and scholars based in the global south. It is social because it goes beyond the recognition of individual scholars to focus on a process of social transformation that challenges the domination of mainstream global North-centric knowledge. And finally, the project is truly scientific because, scientific not in the narrow sense where a partial form of knowledge is ascribed the status of being value neutral and objective, and is projected to be universal, but rather is rooted in radical critiques, challenging the biased understanding of knowledge. Thank you, Veronica, Gregory, Natalie, and Nikhil for such an extensive, engaging session. We really hope to continue these conversations through our research and advocacy efforts at Economists for Future International as well. For those of you who are still there with us, I would like to remind that you can stay updated on our past and future work and research and campaign on our website, economistforfuture.org, and stay at speed with what's going on at the network through our Twitter handle as well. If you'd like to be part of our network or of the movement, feel free to get in touch with us through our website. And to everybody else who joined, thank you for being with us here today on a Sunday.
One quick question. Will those presentations of Professor Amarante and Natalie be available? I found them interesting. I do bibliometric work as well as too on. So will they be available on a website, or can you email them to me? I'd love to. I'd love to digest them more fully. Okay.
Yeah. I also would like to have Ricky's presentation, Ricky and Natalie presentation.
Yeah, we will do that. I mean, we'll process this recording as well and update it. And apart from that, the specific PPTs, we'll send it over email as well. So yeah, thank you for joining us on a Sunday and have a great week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.